Howdy folks, and welcome back. This is the second video in my Armageddon series of painting content where I paint up half of the box and Mike from Flashing Badger paints up the other half. I've been tasked with the Space Marines and I thought I'd start off with some White Scars successors. Now I'm going to do this in reverse. I'm going to start with the squads, and today we're going to be painting a squad of intercessors in the Scheme of the Marauders chapter. A White Scar successor in a yellow that I think is very, very easy to achieve. Now, of course, you could use this for your Imperial Fists or any other yellow armored scheme, so stay tuned for more. I wanted my Marauders chapter intercessors to stand out a little bit more and look a tiny bit more savage than straight out of the box. So I combined and kitbashed some of the Red Corsair Raiders bits up, gave my Sergeant a cape and a bunch of other armor mark helmets, and here's what we have. I'm going to kick things off priming all 10 of these intercessors with a Wraithbone spray. Now you may be asking yourself, why use magenta if I'm going to end up with yellow armor? This is just an undershade to use to make that yellow look less green and a little bit more vibrant. You totally don't have to do this step, but I think it just gives a slightly more punchy and vibrant yellow on your tabletop. Now you don't have to be too neat here, really we're just trying to get this Doomfire magenta into all of the deepest of recesses. However, I do go and coat the entire miniature in this paint. If you get it on a bit thick and it starts pooling, no matter, we are going to do some added steps later on. There we have it, 10 Emperor's Children, White Scar's successors here, ready for the next step. What we're going to do here is we're going to go back to the garden with our Wraithbone spray, and we're going to spray from the top in a zenithal prime with the white over the top of this pink, leaving it in the deepest recesses and underneath in the shadows. So here we are after the Wraithbone spray. You can see underneath these miniatures from the bottom they still contain some of that Doomfire magenta, but from the top they are very much an off-white. The next paint I'm going to be using is Citadel Imperial Fists. Of course I'm not painting Imperial Fists, but their yellow is very, very close to the Marauders. I have to say Imperial Fist is the absolute best contrast paint in yellow that you can get from Citadel, and I do think that honestly if you're going to be painting yellow, particularly Imperial Fists or anything like this on a big scale, using just ordinary paints to achieve a smooth, nice finish is just not going to work unless you're using an airbrush. So I think if you're using a brush, not an airbrush, contrast paints with yellow are the way to go. Now I'm being a bit more careful this time not to let this pool in too many areas, and I'm taking each section at a time. So I'll do a pauldron, a helmet, a leg, and I'll just work my way around the miniature, taking my time, just letting this contrast paint sit smoothly on the surfaces. Okay, so there we have it. The Imperial Fists has nearly dried. I just want to show you the sort of variation in tone that we get underneath now, applying the yellow over the top of that Doomfire magenta. We just get a gorgeous, vivid pink that looks warm and hot. It doesn't look greenish at all. This is a really, really nice way to do it. Okay, so the first paint we're going to be using here is some Black Templar contrast paint. This is for all of the rubber connectors on the armor, so in the elbows and the knees and around the groin area, as well as any other black details like the chest eagle or the Aquila as well. Next up, we're going to go to our first normal paint, and this is Rhinox Hide, and this will be to base coat all of the leather pouches and belts on these miniatures. Next up, we're going to be doing the metals, and this is for any of the silver areas on the model. We're going to be using Citadel's Ironbreaker, which is a nice mid-silver. This is going to be used for the gun barrel, any knives and little trinkets on these guys, as well as any sort of key details that you think should be blocked out in metal. For any of the sort of relics and trinkets on these miniatures, I'm going to be blocking those out in Emperor Gold from Army Painter. This is a really, really nice, rich, warm gold, and I'll just be doing this on any of those Imperial crosses and any little doodads hanging off the belts there. The Sergeant's coming along nicely, and the next paint we're going to be using is a foundation for red. I'm going to be using Blanched Berry from Army Painter, and this is a really, really nice base layer to build up a nice, rich red from. Now I don't want to go too crazy with red details on these, as I will be using red decals later as well, but the cape on the Sergeant here to mark him out differently to the rest of the squad is going to be based in this Blanched Berry. Also, any other sort of little details like the wax seals on the Purity seals as well will be done in this Blanched Berry. Onto our first edge highlight, and this one is going to be a very stark, quite obvious highlight on the guns. So mainly the black areas of this miniature. We're going to do the chest aquila as well as the sort of edges of each of these guns with some Administratum Grey. Now it's quite a jump to go from Black Templar all the way up to Administratum Grey, but you'll see later I'm going to use another couple of processes to blend everything in, but we want things nice and stark to begin with. Take your time, use a thin brush and just work your way around the edges of these black areas. Gorthor Brown is our highlight for the leather areas as well, and this is just to sort of catch the edges of all those leather areas just to make things pop a little bit more. The next contrast paint we're using is on the paper on the Purity seals, and this will be Skeleton Horde. Take your time, don't let this pull too much as it can make things look a bit too obvious if you go crazy. Next up, we're using my absolute favorite Citadel contrast paint in Rattling Grime. This is for all of the metallics, yes, the gold and the silver all over this. We're going to dull that bright, vivid silver and gold right down with a nice, murky, oily layer of Rattling Grime. We're at the halfway point now, and all of these Marines have been base coated. The next step will be to do some decals, but first off, let's go and catch up with Mike from Flashing Badger to see how he's getting on with the Orc half of Armageddon.
So Damon, I've painted my Pain Boy and I've sent you a picture so you can actually see what it looks like.
I just glanced it. Amazing, dude. So good.
So he's got a cape going because he's a bit of a hero. But the Grot Orderly is actually the doc in my army.
Oh, that's awesome. Great idea.
So people will foolishly shoot at the bigger orc, who is in fact the Orderly, who is just carrying around the things for our talented Gretchen. And then the Weird Boy, the goal here is to have him like absolutely bursting with bright warp energy. So that he sticks out on the battlefield. I want him just...
Oh, he certainly does, doesn't he? Do you know what? Like at first glance, I got a sort of Japanese cherry blossom vibes because it's the pink of a cherry blossom, but you've got the green of the, the greenery around it as well, and it's a really cool, like green and pink goes so well together.
All right, well, I'll get stuck on the next 3 now, and we'll have an update for you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a tiny preview of my captain because I still haven't decided on scheme. Maybe I'll let the audience decide on the scheme here, but if we can see a little bit there, we have got a cafe shield, a mace on the captain, and a huge top knot as well as lots of battle damage, and of course the breakfast basing idea, which we'll talk through later as well.
All right, well, I think you should get back to some more World Cup games because that can stall you while I try and catch up with my orcs, and then we'll touch base again and see where we're at.
Perfect.
Wow, fantastic work from Mike there. I have to say, I'm pretty jealous. Can I live up to the expectations and even compete with how well he has painted the Orc side of Armageddon so far? So it's now on to the details, and we're going to start with some decals. Looking at the transfer sheet that we get in Armageddon, it does actually have some White Scar transfers in there. However, because I've gone for a yellow scheme, I do feel that the red on these transfers is a little bit too bright and doesn't match the red on the rest of my miniature, as well as the yellow. It just wouldn't look right putting yellow onto a yellow pauldron. So instead of that, I've gone all the way to Horus Heresy. 10,000 years back and $60 later, we have the Horus Heresy White Scars transfer sheet, which I have to say is quite possibly the nicest transfer sheet ever made by Games Workshop. Loads and loads of really cool sort of Asian-inspired transfers here. Seeing as I'm doing an army of 3 different White Scar successor chapters, I thought it would be better to unify everything together by using some of the lesser-known White Scars transfers instead of just using A, White Scars transfers, and B, freehanding when I'm absolutely rubbish at it. Okay, so I've picked out some transfers for the pauldrons here. I've got a lovely sort of like yin and yang vibe for the left pauldron, and I've also got what appears to be 2 axes on top of each other, and this is going to be for the right pauldron. I feel like with the Marauders sort of chapter icon being a flaming sword, the only weapon I have on this transfer sheet are the axes here, so it fits fairly well. We're going to be using Micro Set and Micro Sol as well. These are 2 products that you absolutely have to use when doing decals on your miniatures. The first one is Micro Set, and that is the blue tube. What we do here is we go straight out of the bottle onto the pauldrons before applying our transfer, and what this does is it acts as the sort of main foundational adhesive for the transfer. This has quite a long drying time, so you can manipulate and move your transfer around, and really with a round transfer on a round pauldron, what you tend to have most of the time if you don't use these products are sort of creases and sort of areas where the transfer gets warped and doesn't really adhere to the miniature. What your micro set and micro sole will do will stretch your decal onto the surface to just make for a much more snug finish. So there we are. While the micro set is drying, let's just have a look to see how these transfers are looking. Pretty awesome, I have to say. I've gone kind of crazy. I've added quite a lot to these guys, but I just think detail is awesome. And, you know, Space Marines do not have a lot of natural detail on them, so just adding these transfers will really give them a lot of flavor. Next up, we're going to build up the red. Now, that blanched berry that I put down earlier into places like the cape on the sergeant are going to be built up using 2 different Citadel reds and a stippling motion. The first red is Evil Sun's Scarlet, and then finally we'll be using Wild Rider Red. Now, I'm using an old knackered brush for this, and I tend to use old knackered brushes most of the time, I have to say, unless I'm doing a lot of detail. What I'm going to be doing here, though, is just taking most of the paint off my brush and just kind of dabbing and stippling and splotching dots and lines and little scratchy bits of detail with this very, very bright red. And what this is going to do is it's going to leave darker areas in the recesses and through the gaps and really start building up some texture onto the cloth. Again, take your time, trust the process. It does seem crazy to go from such a dark color all the way up to this vivid red, but it really does work by the end. Now, I did the same onto the Purity Seal wax as well, and now we're just going to go with that final red and just edge highlight any of the creases and crevices and sort of areas that stand out and catch the light. I've got to say this guy's looking pretty awesome at this point. Now it's time to highlight the actual armor itself. We're going to go with Flash Gitz Yellow here. This is just a very basic edge highlight. It's actually not that bright a yellow on top of this. It kind of matches the yellow, but what it will do is just kind of neaten up any areas where there's any sort of inconsistencies. So again, take your time with a thin brush and just go around the sort of areas that you want to be accentuated just slightly and just neatened up. After that, we're going to do a final edge highlight of Sun Petal from Army Painter. This one is almost a fluorescent yellow. It is super, super light, and this is going to be a final edge highlight just on the sort of highest of areas and points on this miniature's armor. There we are. So at this point, things are looking pretty great, I have to say. Let's have a look at these 10 boys before we move on to the next step. I really, really love how vibrant and bright this yellow is, particularly where we have that magenta in the recesses. A really rich looking scheme. Right, let's get these boys out of the way for a second. Do you have a minute to hear about the holy, holy benefits of the enamel wash? What's that? Yes, you do. Okay, right. Well, so normally I use oil washes and sometimes I use the Villainy Inks stuff as well. However, recently I've been experimenting with AK Interactive's vast range of different colored military inspired enamel washes. Now, these things are a fraction of the price of anything from, say, Grimdark Compendium, and they're also kinda better because you get a lot more choice. These guys do not take too long to dry. They are easy to manipulate. You can thin them down well and they just match exactly what you need. You need a color? AK have got you sorted. You know, prior to this, I was using streaking grime all the time, and then I found out there's actually different types of streaking grime. We can get darker streaking grimes, we can get more greenish streaking grimes, but here I've gone and bought a few sort of key enamel washes. I've got a black one here. I've got a rust as well. We've got the dark streaking grime as mentioned earlier. We've got some dust and rust deposits. And finally, the real hero in this paint scheme, our wash for German dark yellow. Now, as far as I'm aware, these guys are not German. They're probably more akin to Mongolians, but we'll call it Mongolian dark yellow for now. Now, these washes are all formulated to match a particular color, and when doing yellow armor and building up to be very, very bright and vivid, I thought I'd start darkening things down and making those shadows really work a lot more with this beautiful Grimdark enamel wash. Now, I am going to thin this down somewhat with some odorless mineral spirits. It's up to you how much you want to thin things down. I'm only adding a small amount of mineral spirits here as I am confident in my ability to wick things away with mineral spirits later on. Now, I will say at this point, I have not varnished my miniature. I do not normally varnish my miniatures unless they are particularly weak paints that don't adhere to the surface too well. Army Painter, I'm looking at you. However, This is, you know, on contrast paints, they seem to work really well and you just don't need to varnish your model. What I'm going to do though is take a really old knackered brush again and just sort of pin wash around any details that I want more richness and darkness in the shadows. Take your time, work your way around the miniature. Do not let this pull too much and try not to get it on the actual flat surfaces. We really just want this building up in all of the recesses. You can see already the capillary action on this, even without a gloss varnish, is absolutely fantastic, particularly if you combine it with some odorless mineral spirits. Okay, so there we go. I've left this to dry for about 10 to 15 minutes, so it's still quite wet at this point, but it is starting to cure quite quickly. I'm then going to go in with some makeup sticks. I've no idea what they're actually called in the cosmetics industry, but they are what they are. We're going to dip the tip of this in some odorless mineral spirits and just gently wipe away any of the excess on those uppermost areas, leaving the Mongolian yellow or German yellow or whatever you called it before in the darkest and deepest of shadows. Now this is going to make a really high contrast, awesome looking yellow scheme. Where I rushed the rest of the squad, let's take a look at one of them that has got a little bit too much enamel wash on it and just see how easy it is to take away any of that built up enamel wash just using a little bit of white spirit or mineral spirits here as well. Just so easy and satisfying to do this reductive process. For the guns and the leather on the miniature, I did quite a stark highlight early on, and I sort of alluded to the fact that I was going to do something later on. So I'm going to be using a black enamel wash here, which is kind of a sort of cold black, and this is landing gear wash. This will just unify those highlights that I did on the guns and the leather earlier and just make everything sort of slightly more matte and slightly more dull. Again, you want to be careful here that you don't get this on the yellow because it is very dark. However, we are absolutely dousing this all over the guns. And to be honest, I'm not even going to remove this with the reductive process. I'm just going to leave it all over the blacks and the leathers. On to the next one, and this is my absolute favorite and something I'm going to be using a lot in these videos, is light dust deposit. Now this is a very sort of pale, dusty, yucky sort of sandy color, and this is what I'm going to be using to sort of dirt up the transfers, the decals a little bit, but also just add some sort of weathering to this armor, because I didn't want to go in and do any sponging on this armor. I want it to look bright and vivid and sort of untarnished, but still kind of dusty and a little bit battle worn without looking too chipped. This one is very strong out of the bottle. You might want to thin this down as well, but really I'm just doing the feet, the knees, and some sort of like areas on the transfers as well. When it comes to the decals, instead of just wiping it straight off, I'm going to do a sort of stippling motion and just sort of create some build-up of texture and dirt over the top of those decals. This is going to make things look a bit more dirty and worn, but mainly it's not going to sort of darken things down too much as this color is quite bright. For the eye lenses, we're just keeping things super simple. I'm going to go in with white scar just to fill out the lenses, and then I'm going to go in with a red contrast paint just to make these guys look a bit more evil. Now, I could use blue here, but we're actually going to make the bases blue, so I don't want to do that. We're near the end now. I'm going to go in with a very bright Runefang steel, and this is just going to be to pick out some of the little details on this miniature, the sort of rivets and any little fine highlights that I want to do on top of the gun barrel, anywhere that we want to catch the brightest of lights. Again, be subtle with this, don't go too crazy, as if you do this all over the miniature, it will kind of ruin what we've done so far. These 10 intercessors are now finished, and I've gone in with a Winsor & Newton Ultra Matte Varnish Spray just to make things look absolutely perfect and matte before we go on to do our bases. For the bases, we're going to coat the entirety of the eggshell. Yes, guys and girls, it is actually eggshell on these bases, in case you were wondering what the texture was. I like to save up the eggshells from breakfast, crush them up, mix them in with sand, and stick them all over my bases. It makes for some really interesting texture, particularly if you want sort of slate or pieces of ice and things, which is exactly where we're going with this one. I'm going to use a black play marker anyway, just to coat all of this in black before we move on to the next step. Now, I know eggshell is quite different in terms of basing materials, so we're going to go even more different here from Armageddon with our typical sort of red sulfur desert sort of landscape, and we're going to go straight to Ice World. Now, the reason for this is because A, I'm bored of doing rusty bases. I've been doing them for a very long time now, and I just want to step outside of my comfort zone a little bit, but also I just feel like a icy blue will go really well with the black, red, and yellow scheme that we've got going through this army. Turquoise Oxide from Green Stuff World is a beautiful sort of liquid pigment wash that we're going to coat the entirety of the base with. Now don't try this at home, kids. I like to go straight out of the bottle onto the base. Now this is not for the faint-hearted. You could easily mess up here. You could get this blue splattered all up the legs. Or you could just it could run out of the bottle too quickly and you could really mess this up. So maybe don't do this, put it onto a palette or something and just apply it with a brush. I just like to do this because it absolutely floods the base and it kind of means that I'm definitely going to get it all into those tricky to reach areas. But just look how different and cold that blue is to that nice warm yellow. All right, now that blue has nearly dried, again, you're going to probably want to wait till it's completely dried. I haven't, I'm impatient. I'm going to go in with Green Stuff World's liquid pigment in white now. And this is going to go all over the top of that lovely blue. Again, straight out of the bottle because I'm an absolute savage. And just letting that capillary action of this white get into all of the deepest areas of the base, bringing out all that lovely eggshell texture. Things are really, really looking great at this point. You can just see how much those liquid pigments have done to this base here. The next thing though, and the final thing, is some Valhallan Blizzard. This is a snow effect from Citadel, and I've got to say I really like it compared to other brands of a similar thing. I'm just going to add a tiny bit onto the end of a spatula here and just put it on the sort of feet a little bit and just move it around the bases. Again, don't use too much of this. If you go overboard, you're going to lose all of the effect of the sort of liquid pigment that we've built up on the base. Just add little bits where realistically this would build up, little chunks of snow and patches on the floor of this icy, icy world. All right, so there you have it, folks. I have to say I am really, really pleased with how these guys turned out. I will say I did do a test model for this, which I don't normally do, and the test model I went a bit overboard on weathering and I didn't actually like it in the end. So I know this is outside of my comfort zone. This is probably the cleanest paint job I've ever done in a video. Certainly it's not as grimdark as my usual style, and you know what, I like it. I'd love to know what you think though. Are these guys looking really, really awesome, or do they look absolutely terrible? I think I know the answer, but again, I'm painting these for me at the end of the day. If you enjoyed this though and you want to copy this scheme, it is super, super easy to do. Just follow all the steps in the video. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, check out the Patreon as well, join the Discord, and absolutely, most importantly, keep following me and Mike from Flashing Badger's journey as we unbox and paint the entirety of Armageddon. That's it for now. Stay tuned for the next one.